All right, so you're in the session that's going to be talking about online source evaluation. We're going to be introducing a concept that's called reading laterally, but it's a fancy way of saying there's a really particular way you should read resources online that's kind of different from how you read like a book or things that you traditionally read from cover to cover. So that's what we're going to be talking about today, is really how do you avoid misinformation online and how do you fact check yourself as you go along reading online sources. We'll also talk about some suggested resources that are good for like checking for misinformation. So I'm going to start here though. I get to start us off talking about why it's so difficult to evaluate information online and why everyone's so fixated on the concept of fake news. It actually just starts with the fact that the information for the longest time was printed in a physical format. And so the library, when you think of a library, you don't really think of Zoom, right? You think of physical books, and you use physical textbooks usually in the classroom. And so for hundreds of years, information was published in a print format. And there's a couple really great things about reading something physically. I mean, you don't get the eye strain, for example, of trying to read something online, but also when things are printed in a physical format, there's a lot of control over how that information is pushed to you. And when I say control, I just mean that information in a print format has had a lot of hands working to get that information published. So when you take a newspaper, for example, that you see in front of you on the screen, that newspaper has editors, it has authors, they have the people who run the paper, the people who printed the paper, and the people who deliver the paper. So print information is a very controlled environment for information. It is more difficult for fake information or fake news or misinformation to be printed in physical formats because there's so many people that control how the information is published. And so librarians like to say that there's a lot of authority control. But when we say that, we're just saying that we really know who authors are in print. There's not a lot of anonymous authors. There's some, famous ones, any kind of like biography of a famous person that's published anonymously, that that person really isn't anonymous. The publishers know who they are because they got paid to publish that information. So we know in a print format who wrote the information, and we can more easily control for misinformation in this format. And then some of you at this point are going, yeah, I kind of know that. I like to start with the obvious because it does influence how we approach information online. We are all trained to read in physical formats. We were all taught to read from picture books, from our parents reading to us out loud, or our teachers reading it to us out loud. We grew up reading things in print, and that's the first way we learn to read. Even if your younger siblings are using iPads at age 3, they're still predominantly learning how to read with a physical format. And if Paizha could change the slide. It isn't to say that there wasn't always fake information or misinformation. Misinformation and fake news or sensationalized news has existed since the 19th century. There's always been these kind of really shady publications like the Brad and Angie over here that publish rumors, sensationalized news. But the difference between a print tabloid, you guys all remember tabloids, and online information is that it still has to be published. And so they can only get away with so much. There's a reputation that these print resources get, and you're taught from a very young age to avoid them because you're taught by your parents or your teachers that this information is not accurate. It's a tabloid. It belongs in the corner of the supermarket. So the crazies who think that Brad and Angie live in Murder City, for example, they're a very small bunch when the information was published in print because you had to go seek out that information, and it was kind of difficult to get. But now everything's online, right? So what's different here? Online information has less control over how it's published, and anyone can publish basically. So when you remove all the barriers to printing, it's like the cost of running a printing press, the cost of hiring authors, and you can just put your information anywhere online. It makes it really easy for fringe groups to come to the surface because now they don't have to go through hoops to get published. And that's why we see a lot of fake news, especially during this last election cycle, coming from a lot of bad players, people who are trying to influence elections, but also just people who don't understand how to fact check their information. A lot of misinformation starts off as just like a rumor or a misinterpretation of a science paper, and it kind of snowballs from there because there's no control over how this information is published. Anyone can publish. It's also very hard to tell what's a good website and what's a bad website because it's so easy to mock up a good looking website. If you think about print, it was a lot harder to mock up a print book. You had to pay a lot more money to make a good print book look solid, right? A lot of money went into that. Here, I can't really tell who publishes websites like the Center for Immigration Studies. It's not obvious by looking at it at first glance who's paying for that website to exist, and also why the website exists to begin with. And then other thing that's really interesting about things that are done online is that they can be controlled by the websites we use. So the search engines we use to find information are owned by companies. Before, we used to go get print information, you would go to like a library or your high school library, and you know, the people controlling that information was the teachers and the librarians. But here, the people controlling the access to information is Google itself. And this concept of bias in how we use search engines is called algorithmic bias. It's basically a fancy way of saying that the people who made Google created the system that we use to access information. And so when you're using Google, they are tracking you, and they will serve you up ads or websites that fit into your identity or your online identity or your online habits. And that also really affects how much information you get. And if you get sucked into some of these fringe groups, then you're going to be seeing more articles and more websites that cater to that fringe group, because you kind of get sucked into it based on the algorithm. And I know I'm kind of preaching to the choir. I think everybody here has had experience with being on, you know, social media, Twitter, Facebook, TikTok, and you kind of see how your friends get sucked into these trends. So you're very familiar with it in a way that older people may not be. But I do like to remind students about this just because it really does affect how you interact with information. You were taught to read a book from cover to cover when you had a physical book. That's just how we taught you how to read as a young person. And online is different. And it's our instinct to read from cover to cover, but you really don't. You really need to stop treating the internet like it's a book and instead read it in a way that you're taking the time to evaluate the information as you go along. So that's why you kind of stop thinking about the website you see online as something that you're going to have to read from cover to cover or to scroll down and read everything. You're only going to look for certain key factors of quality before you read the entire article. And that's what we're here today to talk to you about. We're going to show you some strategies about how you can read information online that differs from how you would read a book. Paizha, did I cover everything?
Yes, sounds perfect for where I'm going to pick it up. All right, so running with that concept of that top to bottom, you know, vertical read, how you used to read a book, how you do read a book still, print book, just based on this sort of image of a person reading a print newspaper. You know, the type of reading where we would read a print source was top to bottom within the information itself. Everything that reader that she's going to read is contained within that print source, right? It's very finite. In the chat, where is the reader in this photo? Like, what do you notice about the behavior of reading in this photo? How would you describe?
Warmer than I am currently. Like, have you guys ever stopped and thought about the act of reading? Like, what does it mean when you're reading? What goes through your head? Like, yeah, she's focused. Mm-hmm. That's great.
Casually, yeah.
Casual.
Kind of just perusing the material that she has at her fingertips. It's a little bit slow, kind of casual. She's outside.
Yeah, I'm struck by like she can read, like when you're not connected to the internet, you know, on the phone, and you're reading outside, it's a lot different. You feel different. And how you experience the narrative is different.
Yeah, and Jaylene, if I'm saying your name correctly, sorry if I'm not, but she's focused, right? Like it's pretty easy to stay focused with a print resource because everything is contained in that one source. I think once we start moving into the online ecosystem, it can get overwhelming really quickly. And we refer to this as information overload. It's really hard to focus on one source, one author, one piece of information. And the other thing I want you to consider is, where did she get the newspaper, right? So if you picked up a newspaper, you may have bought it from the store at Ralph's. Maybe you got it for free on a corner somewhere in one of those newspaper bins where they used to have free newspapers that were published by the city or something that had events that were going to be in the city. And so there was a distributor involved. And that's what Jenn was talking about earlier, which was, you know, there's the reputation of the distributor that's at stake. There's the decision that goes into play when Ralph's decides, are we going to distribute the New York Times? Why or why not? Are we not going to distribute the National Enquirer? If we do distribute tabloid, where will we put it? They were a little bit more involved in the distribution, and there were more things at stake with the reputation of the paper, reputation of the journalists, and that's still true for places like the New York Times, but there's also a lot of news out there and information out there where there is no distributor, maybe. You know, we don't really know who's producing the information, and we're just being presented with it through Google, through a search engine, and also because a lot of websites too will aggregate, and I'll touch on this in just a minute, but they'll aggregate other sources for you. And I just mean by that, they'll collect different articles that they want to share with you, or that for some reason they want to share with people who visit their website. And so the information that you have access to depends on where you start out, where you access the information, right? If you get the information from the Center for Immigration Studies, for example, which publishes sources like this one, I found this news article by nationalinterest.org through a news aggregator. And I'm not really sure what that news aggregator is. I don't really know the organization's name. I'm not familiar with this publisher either. So what we're trying to help you out with today is understanding, you know, in the World Wide Web area, you're not alone. There's information coming from, you're not alone like the reader on the bench, right? There's information coming from all different websites. Google's helping you find them, social media. And so the trouble is figuring out first who's behind the information. We can do a vertical read with this kind of source. Sure, right? Like if I were to do a vertical read, I might think, okay, what's the bias with this? And I can look through and look for language. And I'm seeing the radicalization of even the mainstream left on immigration, makes concessions, unthinkable, some strong language. It seems to be bias against the left, right? So you can kind of tease out with some of the language, some loaded language. Also ads, right? Like you see some veterans, Air Force advertisements trying to sell things. You can kind of tease out through a vertical read where it might be bias. But before even doing that, it's worth using what's called lateral reading to find out what is this nationalinterest.org organization. Because before I even spend time reading it, I might want to know who put the information out there. And there, you might hear of some strategies like looking for a URL. If it's a .org, people say, you know, oh, if it's a .org, then it's a nonprofit, therefore it's not biased. Unfortunately, that's not the case. Anyone can put a .org website together, and a lot of organizations that have a .org are very biased. They might have funding from sources that are very politically motivated or that are trying to sell certain things. So just because a website is a .org does not necessarily mean it's going to be an unbiased nonprofit organization.
Paizha, is nonprofits always a good thing?
Well, I guess it depends on what you mean by good. I mean, like, not necessarily, because a nonprofit can be a political advocacy organization, right? So it could be an organization that is formed in order to advocate for the election of a specific congressman or the president. And they could get money from lobbyists to further that agenda, right? Anything you want to add to that?
No, just saying that just because something's a nonprofit doesn't mean that it's going to be a trustworthy source too, because they could be using misinformation just as easily as any other resource can.
Right.
Nonprofit just means they're not making money off of it in the same way like other sites can make money.
Yeah, not directly. They're not directly making a profit.
They're always making profits, but it's not directly.
So the URL doesn't really work. These are some of the vertical top to bottom indicators that we have. The URL doesn't really work. Whether or not the logo is professional looking, anyone can design a logo that looks professional. You can find some indication as to, you know, what advertisements are present. You can try to figure out who the author is. In this case, I actually looked at this one, and the author of several of the articles that are published by this company are by the CEO of the company. I was like, interesting. Why are there not a wide variety of journalists who are publishing for this resource? Why is it the people who own the company, the CEO who's publishing? So there are some indicators, but before you do the vertical read, you can, and here's another example of the logo looks pretty professional, right? But just looking at this, everyone who's here in the chat, what is this organization?
I mean, they have a Reddit logo. They should be legit, right? I just like
the
their
Flat
choices.
Earth Society. Yeah.
I like their choices of social media. You got Facebook, Twitter, Reddit, and then Google Plus. Okay. Have you guys ever heard of the Flat Earth Society?
Is it the people who believe in the theory?
Yes.
Yes. The flat Earth. They're basically the Earth is flat instead of round. Like
Yeah.
they have a pretty nice website. I like it. It's got a nice like color scheme going on. It looks kind of pro, and it doesn't look like a crazy person's website basically.
Yeah, they have a whole library you can read up about. There's a wiki where people write different articles about the theory. So just at a glance, it's hard to tell. If you'd never heard of the Flat Earth Society, I would have to open up a tab, which gets me to the next slide. Open up a tab and figure out, what is this organization that's putting out this information? Who's behind it? So first, before you even spend too much time, if you come across an article or a website and you're like, I'm struggling, you're trying to do a vertical read of an article and figure out if it's biased, just stop, open up a tab. It's one of the benefits of not being isolated in this online environment is that you can open up a tab and see what other people have said about an organization. So this is a technique that's used by fact checkers, and you just read along the horizontal axis, open up Google, and usually if the organization is associated with some questionable things, or if the theory is questionable, you're going to get something pretty quick through Wikipedia, through fact-checking websites that, with this example, the Center for Immigration Studies, this website, the Southern Poverty Law Center, has categorized this organization as a hate group. So pretty quickly, you're going to start to see, okay, I might need to approach things that I find on this website with some caution. And you can read about what other people have mentioned. We're going to talk about how to read about what other people have mentioned in a couple minutes. And I also wanted to mention, this isn't a foreign concept. Like, we've all done lateral reading before. When you pick up a magazine at a print magazine, or when you pick up a book, you're going to read the cover. You're going to be like, all right, what is this I'm looking at? Sometimes you'll look at the jacket, see what the summary is, read about the author a little bit. Sometimes you'll flip it over and you'll see the Rolling Stones, for example, said this was the best book of the decade. And you'll see, okay, I know who the Rolling Stones is. I have prior knowledge there. because if you haven't heard of the author, maybe you've heard of Rolling Stone, right? So like we've done this kind of entering into a conversation, because with information, we're not just existing in all by ourselves with the information. We consume information in a very social way. And so it's important to read what other people have said, to read from different types of organizations that you may or may not be familiar with. And the more you do lateral reading, the more you're going to become familiar with some of the fact-checking sort of websites that you can use to read more about an organization. Okay, so moving into the first resource for fact-checking, oftentimes you'll hear of these fact-checking websites, so like Snopes, Politifact. Here's what Politifact looks like. And these sites are, Snopes and Politifact both are independent. They're not politically affiliated, meaning they're not run by someone who's politically affiliated. They're transparent in terms of who their writers are, what their funding is, and what their policies and ethics are for evaluating information. And I'm going to show you, oh great, perfect timing, Jennifer.
So I posted a link in the chat to show you why we're recommending Politifact as a resource. They're are you saying this or am I?
Go ahead, you go.
Politifact is very transparent with where they're coming from, and in a way that is really refreshing. A lot of times these websites, like think about BuzzFeed. Does BuzzFeed really tell you like how they make their money and how much they get in people clicking on their ads? Most websites don't tell you how they make their money. And I always tell my business students, this is on purpose, because a lot of times they're hiding something. They don't want to show you how they make their money. Disney doesn't want to show you how much money they're making off of Disney Plus or all their streaming shows, because that's information that gives them an edge in the competition. But PolitiFact tells you straight up that they are a nonpartisan fact-checking site that deals with politics, and that they started off from a newspaper, so the Tampa Bay Times, but then they were bought by another institute, the nonprofit school for journalists. So they're straight up and telling you right here that yes, they're biased. Their bias is that they're run by journalists, but they're going to be honest with you to say that they have a journalistic slant to their resources. They also say that they get money from that institute. And if you keep scrolling down, you find out that they will even tell you how many grants they got. They will tell you how much money they got in donations. The truth squads are just people who are part of the donors to this organization. So this is how they're making their money, from all these different groups that are paying, spending money to have them do fact checking.
And they even tell you who the Truth Squad is here. So it's individual donations. So that could be someone like me. So you and I, anyone in this room right now, could donate to Politifact. So yeah, that's the Truth Squad. And then the foundations are the other piece. So like bigger charitable organizations or foundations that give money to causes have given to Politifact.
And I guess maybe you might be thinking, well, it's still biased because it's talking about politics. And in the way we talk about bias in this country, we tend to think of that as being like a left versus right scenario, where if you have any inclination of politicalness in your conversation, or you happen to be a Democrat and you mention that in the classroom, that's a sign of bias. Librarians think of bias differently. We really think of bias more of, why was this information put online? Who pays for that information to exist? Who paid for the book to be published? And yeah, the people here, Google spent $50,000 giving Politifact money to do their work, but I know that up front, so I can make an educated decision if I'm going to trust Politifact or not. If it goes against my my democratic values, that's my thing. That does not mean that the source is not good. It just doesn't fit my worldview, and that's fine. Don't use it. I like resources that tell me straight off who's behind it, because that way it gives me control back of how I use the information. And you'll find very few websites do this. They don't tell you how they make their money. So it makes finding information very difficult. And so this is one resource we do say, yeah, we trust it because they are very upfront with how they make their money, where their bias is, which is a journalistic bias, and who will continue to support them, which is, you know, Google and individual contributions.
And they'll also tell you what their methods are and principles for who checks the information. So you can read all about funding, like Jen just mentioned, but also how they determine the ratings for their fact-checking scale that they have, where they rate the truth to certain claims that they have. They also talk about their ethics policy for journalists, how we choose to fact check, and they tell you all about you know, which questions they run through. So there's a lot of transparency, which is why they list that value. They're independent, they're transparent about as much as possible about where their bias is and what their process is and why that information is there, how it has come to be there in terms of funding and process.
I guess in summary, it's really hard to avoid bias altogether. We're all individuals with our own perspectives and flaws. And like, as a person of color, I'm presenting this one way, different from how Paizha is presenting it. So like, we're all gonna have what we grew up with and our values on the table when we teach and when we read information. The point though, is we're saying, think about how much bias is visible. And if they're not open to saying where they get their money or how their information is influenced, then that's probably something you should think about and maybe avoid that source or take some of that information with a grain of salt. I will say a lot of newspapers don't have this transparency in themselves. So even though Los Angeles Times is a very well-known, respected newspaper, they will from time to time have flawed information. And there's a bunch of politics that go on into running a newspaper. So even when you're sure the source is pretty good, always be a little bit skeptical.
And so, you know, with we take that example that we had, the Center for Immigration Studies, and this is what the website looks like. So this is a Google search of it, but first I want to show you the website. And earlier when I mentioned that it aggregates information, what I mean is that, like with this article, for example, if I click this, if I want to read the article, it takes me to a different news source. So they're pushing to the front news and information that they sort of represents what they view, right, to be what they want to push. Whereas with Google Scholar, or sorry, with Google News, what's being pushed to the front might be what's matching based on your algorithm bias that Jen mentioned earlier with your filter bubble. So how you're finding the information is also important. And especially with things like social media, where people are pushing, you know, they tend to only get their news from one source, right? So if I really only got my news from this website, I'm only seeing what they're choosing for me to see. And we're seeing this more and more with online information, even with something like Netflix, right? Like, you only see the media that they're choosing to include on the app. So whether or not that's good or bad is for you to kind of think about, but it's just a thing to be aware of, that if you are, you know, going to use this as a source to find your information and find news, it's really important that I first figure out who this organization is. And I can read a little bit about them, but it's also a really good practice to just open up a tab and search them in Google. And right away, you know, you can see Southern Poverty Law Center has a write-up about something to do with the Center for Information Studies, so I could read that. A go-to think tank for anti-immigrant movement, might be some controversy I can read about there. And Wikipedia, we're going to cover that in just a minute. But sometimes you'll also see like Politifact, right? So we just talked about this fact-checking website. Or you can read more about their profile on GuideStar. This is a website that publishes where organizations get their funding. So we could find out who's behind this organization. Are they receiving large donations by specific people? And because that can influence their bias, that GuideStar helps us figure out where they're getting their money. So it's always just kind of a good idea. And then Jen's going to talk about this next, but other news papers may publish controversies about the fact that, okay, does the Center for Immigration Studies deserve to be labeled a hate group? So because news agencies are in the business of talking about controversial issues, controversial organizations, you might even see articles by other newspapers about the organization itself, especially if it's controversial. So Google can be useful for doing that lateral read.
We're basically encouraging you to have multiple tabs open. You might have heard like your other high school writing teachers say, oh, you shouldn't multitask. But we're actually telling you to multitask in an online environment because it's really important that you don't waste your time reading a bad source. You should first figure out if it's worth your time, because there's so much information out there that it can get super overwhelming if you try to read everything from, like I said, cover to cover. So instead, we're telling you to multitask, not too much. I mean, don't go play video games and do your research at the same time, but you should have a couple of tabs open to like Google. I'm going to talk about Wikipedia, and whatever you find, you can open that tab and investigate the organization, like think of the website as an organization and look at that and see if it fits what you need for that information.
Detective work.
Yeah, basically. See
so
that
I would read through this, see what the controversy is.
And they are, in fact, a hate group. They have such a cute logo. But no.
Yeah. And so now if I were to use this website to find information, I'd probably use it with a much different lens. I'd be very careful. I might want to know, what are people saying in terms of very sort of misinformed, sort of heavily biased, potentially incorrect information. Not that I can't decide for myself how I feel about a certain article, but at least I'll have that caution going in, that flag. Because we have to judge for ourselves in this online medium, because anything can be published, right? There's a lot of fringy stuff out there. Okay, so that's a little bit about fact-checking websites.
We said Snopes in the slide. We didn't show you Snopes, but that's another very old website that has been around since I was in school, and that was many years ago. So they're really trustworthy. We recommend Snopes as well. So, right, newspapers is one other option you could do, seeing what other news outlets have to say about your organization. If there's something controversial like the one we just saw, like the Washington Post wrote about the controversy of this organization. So, but having said that, not everything that's a journalist or a newspaper is going to be quality. We all have seen some of those free newspapers on the sides of the corners of our streets, littering up the streets. The free stuff that you get in the mail is not going to have the same quality as something that's older and established, like the LA Times. And I feel like reporters get a bad rap because they do get things wrong. They tend to sensationalize the news so they can sell papers. But honestly, a lot of journalists for big newspapers companies like the New York Times and the LA Times, they've either got a master's degree in journalism or they have decades of work in journalism. So they are voices of experience when they tell stories. You just got to be careful and pick which news sources you trust. And we can give you some like suggestions, but ultimately, websites change, newspaper chains get bought out, and you need to also just have confidence in who you are going to get your information from. If you want to trust the LA Times, you should probably, research the LA Times. Who owns the LA Times now? It's been bought out a couple times. Who owns the KTLA 5 News? Who's running those local news stations that we see all the time growing up? Are they people that we trust, or are they people who have a certain agenda? There's also things too, newspapers have a lot of op-eds, and a lot of students get confused when they see an op-ed because they think that viewpoint an opinion piece. Newspapers also publish opinion pieces where it's just the opinion of the author. It's not necessarily a hard fact-found news article, and most reputable newspapers will tell you if it's an op-ed or not, but there's some that are, the Guardian's not 100% great about it, but they may not tell you it's an opinion till the very last minute. So just be careful about too, when you read a newspaper article, sometimes you might be looking at an opinion, and you just got to make sure that you read the byline to make sure that it says opinion on there. You can access news too various ways. You can access news from Google if anyone still has Google News Reader. That's very old. Students get news from their social media accounts. So I don't think any of you guys are on Facebook anymore, but if someone trends something on Tumblr or Twitter, someone talks about it on TikTok, I don't know. I'm not on TikTok. That's one way you can consume news, but just be careful because when it's in a social media platform, it's now just the article and you can't actually really investigate the resources easily if it's coming from a link in your Facebook account or whatever you guys are using.
Jen, when you mentioned the byline earlier, that byline is usually where? About the op-ed or reporting?
Yeah, it usually says at the very beginning of an article, opinion. And it'll maybe in small print, but it should say opinion if it is an op-ed. So just be careful when you're reading something for, like a newspaper article and it seems a bit like bias, it might be an opinion piece, and just look at the top line to make sure that you know it's an opinion piece or not. You can also get papers from our library, articles that are aggregated from a library database, but when it's coming from a library database, again, it's just the article. It's not going to have the rest of the content from the website. So sometimes students also have a hard time reading from our library databases because it's aggregating, AKA pooling all the information into one place, and you don't know where that came from initially. So there's a lot of things that make it difficult to tell if something's bad or misinformation. If it feels difficult to you guys, it's done on purpose. The system is kind of structured to hide how people make money and why information is published. So it's not just you. It's like we as librarians have a hard time finding good information as well. It gets harder every year.
Another thing I want to bring up about the databases is I didn't even realize this, and I think a lot of people don't, but when you find an article through like LA Times commercially, and you get to that, it usually gives you about 5 articles free, right? Like through the app, you'll have 5 free articles per month, and you read 5 of them, and then they ask for your money. You have to subscribe. The library does have subscriptions to these newspapers, which is what you see over here. Looks like this, what Jen mentioned, the library databases. But they look different because they're presented in a different manner than they are presented on the commercial databases, or sorry, the commercial websites. So you can find the same article on a commercial website that you can find in the database that looks like this. It'll just appear different, but it's the same article. It's the same information, it just is presented differently. Because the way information is presented, it might be trying to sell you something through the commercial database. Maybe there's ads, maybe it's a little bit easier to look at, whereas the library is to inform. It's just presenting the information for you to consume, not for a sales reason, right? So it's really kind of dry looking, but it's the same information.
We have 15 minutes left. We wanted to make sure we talk about Wikipedia, don't we?
Yeah.
Okay. I hope that makes sense, that what we're saying basically is information can look different depending on how you consume the information. So you just got to be kind of cautious. And if you're doing something on social media, it takes a lot of extra work to verify that information is correct versus reading it natively in Google. Natively, you know, Googling the website and reading it on the website. But I do also want to mention another resource you have at your disposal, which would be Wikipedia. We have a slide for that, right? Yeah. All right. So Wikipedia, the big bad wolf. So your professors and your high school teachers are always saying, don't use Wikipedia for information because anybody can edit it. And you know what? That's true. Wikipedia is a resource online where anyone can contribute articles to it. That's the beauty of Wikipedia. It's a crowd-created, sourced information resource. And why we tell you not to use it in college is just because, you know, it is crowdsourced, so it's very hard to figure out who wrote individual articles. And there's a lot of instances where articles can be vandalized cyberly, where people, like, you know, say Mark Hamill dies tomorrow and I'm devastated because I love Luke Skywalker, and somebody could very easily manipulate the website to say that, and so I wake up the next day and think he's dead, but he's not. That's why we kind of avoid using Wikipedia for citing in our research, because it can be edited by anybody. But the beauty of Wikipedia as a source itself is that because it's crowdsourced, there's a lot of great information out there done by some really crazy enthusiasts. If you're very into Star Wars, Wikipedia is great because a lot of fans contribute to the Wikipedia page because they love Star Wars and they love Mark Hamill. So they write interesting information that we don't see in the LA Times. And why I like to talk about it in these classes is because I also use Wikipedia as a librarian to evaluate sources. I will sometimes, or Paizha and I will sometimes open up the Wikipedia page for an organization that I think are suspicious, and we'll see what the crowd says. So if you look at this picture for the Center for Immigration Studies, the crowdsourced information on Wikipedia also says that this is a very suspect website. And Wikipedia has a surprising amount of quality control. So not anyone can write off Mark Hamill or Harrison Ford. It takes a lot of effort to vandalize a Wikipedia article because there's so many editors that can overwrite your claims. And there's a very strict content policy on Wikipedia. They have high standards for what is a good article. And so there are people who spent decades on this website developing a reputation on Wikipedia, and they kind of police the crazy people who try to vandalize the sites. So there's actually a lot of quality control in Wikipedia that is good for fact checking, but also just for casual reading. And so anytime you don't need to use a scholarly source for paper, but you want to find information about a topic, you can always start with Wikipedia. It has good information, especially about really esoteric subjects like Star Wars or, and in our case, the Center for Immigration Studies. That still is very useful to you. You don't have to cite it in your papers to get use out of it. And on the daily part of our lives, I think a lot of us will use Wikipedia to get information and to fact check our information. And I really want to encourage that because Wikipedia has a lot of great things to offer. It's very easy to use. Like we said, they do have standards. I know it doesn't seem like it, but some of the great articles that Wikipedia recommends in the front page are articles that have a lot of citations in it. And if there's one thing you might have learned in high school is that you can go through a Wikipedia article and you can go down to the works cited page at the very bottom and try to cite those sources instead, because your professor told you not to use Wikipedia, but they didn't say anything about using the cited sources at the end of the Wikipedia article. I know you do it because I do it too. And that's really a good research skill to have, to utilize somebody else's cited works for your own paper. We highly encourage that as librarians. If you get a really good scholarly article for a class, you can always go to the back of the paper and look at their cited works, the references page, and you can look at those articles and see if you want to use those articles in your paper as well. That is a very good research tool and tip, because the reason why it's cited at the end of the paper, or the reason why it's cited in Wikipedia, is it's another source that's verifying the truths that are in that page. So you can use them as well.
And we always say, be as direct as possible, right? Like another reason why we don't typically cite Wikipedia, it's an encyclopedia. It's information that's compiling. It's a reference tool. So it's like, it's great to find out if someone was born, if something happened, if an event actually happened. And there are 1,200 editors who volunteer to enforce the content policies, flag vandalism, claims must be hyperlinked, links must work. I've encountered Wikipedia pages where sometimes the links don't work, so it does happen. But yeah, it's compiling, it's an encyclopedia, it's compiling information for you. So let's look at, I'll open a new tab so we can show you what we mean when we say at the end here. And I'm sure some of you have probably done it.
I think you guys have seen it before, but it's good to articulate again.
And it's citing secondary sources, right? Wikipedia itself is just a reference source.
Does everyone know what encyclopedia is though? Because that's the other thing that I think is not clear these days. You might have used encyclopedia in like elementary school. It's just like a book about everything. So an encyclopedia will like talk about just random entries that just give you a brief description about a topic, and it's just meant to introduce you to something. It's like not totally focused on one thing. It's a resource about everything, and that's what Wikipedia is. It's a resource about everything. It does great individual articles, but on the whole, you don't go there for one thing, you go there for many things.
And so with this claim, for example, the Southern Poverty Law Center designated CIS as a hate group with ties to the American Nativist movement. Wikipedia isn't saying, it's our opinion that it's a hate group. They're saying this happened, because they're an encyclopedia. They're saying this happened, and here's the source that will show that it happened. So if I were to want to cite, the Southern Poverty Law Center classified this organization as a hate group, I wouldn't cite Wikipedia. I would cite the Southern Poverty Law Center directly. And hopefully this Wikipedia link will work and I can go straight there. And it does. So then I would cite this website, not Wikipedia.
And there's probably other sites you might be familiar with that are very similar to Wikipedia. And so we do encourage you to think and use those resources that are really comfortable with. That's why we like to say, if you're going to use Wikipedia, use it just responsibly. Just think about how you're going to use it. Don't cite it directly, but maybe investigate the page you see here and pick those resources that best structure your argument for your research paper. Another quick thing to do too is if you get an idea on Wikipedia, but you don't know where to start to get like more college-friendly resources, is you can turn to a librarian and say, I found this great article about the Southern Poverty Law Center, but I don't know a lot about them. Can you help me find some great articles that I can use for my research at the college level? And then that's what we could be happy to help you do the research. It doesn't matter where you get your ideas, as long as you get them fact-checked and supported with really good resources. And that's where the librarians come in, because we do that for a living and we're really experienced at pulling information from library databases and also just making sure that you avoid the bad sources.
Yeah, and we're showing you this too. We know I cold search Google all the time. I don't always use the library resources when I want to do research. Sometimes I'll use Wikipedia, then I'll branch out and okay, I'll want to know, has there been more written about this organization? Or maybe I want to know more about what hate groups are and how they've negatively impacted something like immigration. Maybe there's scholarly research that's been published on that. That's when I would turn to a librarian. But we want to, add to that the Google and this online information ecosystem isn't something that should be, feared or avoided, because it's really part of the picture. And lateral reading and opening up a tab and just learning more about organizations, the more you do it, the more you're going to learn about organizations that are maybe associated with subjects you're interested in, or knowing news sources that you do like, that you want to turn to.
Does anyone have any questions? Or thoughts? Feels? We're not giving you a lot of sources to like go to beyond Snopes, Wikipedia, and Politifact. It's because information changes so quickly. Like we could recommend a really good website and like they could be bought out by like a really bad organization the next day. And like, we don't necessarily want you to get locked into one thing, but just thinking about it critically and trying to investigate on your own and really embracing your inner Wikipedia fan and doing a lot of the research yourself is the best way to avoid fake information. I'm sorry, it's not one answer. I'm sorry, I can't just say, use this, don't use that, because it's really not that simple. And I really wish it was, but it's not. Because we also see fake news all the time, and it gets difficult every year to find a good source.
And we hope it helps to think about where you encountered the information and where you encountered it, who's pushing it on social media, or where did you encounter it through a website? Do you know about that initial source? Kind of will give you that skepticism to be able to think, okay, well, I encountered it here, but I don't really know what this organization is. So maybe open up a tab and do a little bit of research on them first before spending so much time with a source and getting frustrated with not knowing where the lack of credibility is because it can be really persuasive in the article itself with that vertical read. And once you find something that's published through an organization, you can do a vertical read and read through it with that critical eye. So if you have any questions, about your research, I just wanted to plug, Jen mentioned, but the librarians are always here. So, if you're doing this kind of research at home for a paper or even just for your personal studies, you're always welcome to, we'd encourage you to ask a librarian if anything comes up. And you can do that through the library homepage through the yellow chat icon.
We're very friendly. It's our job to help you. We're student services. So that's like basically what we do is we just help people. And if we can't answer it, we will find somebody who can answer it for you. And that's it's basically what we're good at, especially since the library is closed. So we are all available online. And then, did we say the chat service is 24 hours? That service, like the chat service we mentioned, is always on. So if it's off the business hours of like 10 to 6, it's still a librarian, but they're not from Cal State L.A. They can probably help you. And if it's too complicated for them, they may refer you back to us. But definitely during the business hours of 10 to 6, it's one of us in person on the computer. So bear with me, I type slow, but I will answer your question as best as I can.
And I know personally, I've used lateral reading since learning about it, and it is personal for me. I have people in my life, a lot of things that are happening with the vaccine, for example, that I've had to check and sort of do lateral reading. What is this person? What are their credentials? Google them, see what, someone who is a doctor interviewing for a journal or a news article that I read, and turns out they had been sort of kicked out of some medical association, had done some questionable research. So it really kind of helped. The goal is for it to help you in your personal life and your academic life, because we're hoping there's crossover between those. Here's a link that we'd like, if you don't mind. This is that's the right link. Let me double check. A survey. Yep, that's the one. So it looks like this, and we really, really appreciate your feedback on the session. So if you wouldn't mind completing that survey, we'd really like your feedback.
Yeah, Paizha and I are really new to this, so be as brutal as you want. We're still learning. This is our first library live class we're doing together. It's always interesting to teach together, so let us know what you thought. And if you think we stunk, we will try to fix it for the next group. It's anonymous, so you can say what you want. I won't be hurt. My feelings will not be hurt. But otherwise, thank you so much for listening. Thank you for coming out of 4:30 on a Monday. That's hard. And I really appreciate that you showed up and listened to us ramble, or mostly me ramble.
Thank you. Have a good
Paizha's
one.
great.
All right, you too.
Yeah, take care, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Yeah,
Bye.
our
Bye.
pleasure.